A parish priest in Devon wrote in 1349, "Of my flock I am the last. There is no one left to bury." That was the entire entry. The next page of the parish register is blank. The page after that is in different handwriting, a replacement, sent months later by a bishop who had very few replacements left to send. A medieval English village had, on average, 200 to 300 people. When the plague came, it did not leave survivors. It left witnesses. And the paradox at the center of this video is one that the medieval mind could not have anticipated, and that, even with everything we know, still unsettles. The village, isolated, rural, surrounded by clean air and open land, should have been the safest place in England. It was not. In some cases, it was the worst. Here is logic that made the village seem safe. London in 1348 was a city of roughly 70,000 people, packed into a walled area of about 1 square mile. The streets were open sewers. The water supply was contaminated. The rats were everywhere. When the plague arrived in the summer of 1348, it moved through London the way fire moves through dry thatch. We covered that image 2 videos ago, and it applies here too. The city lost somewhere between 1/3 and half its population in a matter of months. So if the problem was density, contact, proximity, everything the city represented, then the village should have been the answer. Spread out, fewer people, less contact, better air, safer. That was the assumption, and it was wrong. Because the plague did not need a city. The plague needed a host, and hosts traveled. The disease reached England at Weymouth in Dorset in June of 1348, a seaman arriving from Gascony. By autumn, it was in London. By winter, it was moving north and west along the trade routes, the roads, the rivers. And those roads and rivers connected London to its food supply, which was the villages. The medieval English village was not isolated in the way we imagine isolation. It was connected to the nearest market town, to passing merchants, to itinerant laborers, to the occasional traveler on a pilgrimage. The connection was thin, but the plague did not need a highway. It needed one person, one flea, one rat on a grain cart coming back from market. The village of West Thickley in County Durham is the most extreme case historians have documented. The plague killed everyone. Not most people, everyone. The village ceased to exist. And West Thickley was not unique in kind, only in completeness. Across England, villages lost 1/3, a half, sometimes 2/3 of their population in a period of weeks. Now, here's where the paradox turns. The very thing that made the village seem safer, its isolation, was what made the plague more devastating once it arrived. London had infrastructure. London had some semblance of civic response, however inadequate. London had doctors, useless doctors, doctors whose best treatment was bloodletting and whose understanding of disease transmission was approximately 400 years from being correct, but doctors nonetheless. London had multiple parishes, multiple priests, multiple points of authority. The village had none of this. The village had one priest. One. He was the spiritual authority, the record keeper, the closest thing to a medical professional, and in many cases, the only literate person in the settlement. When the plague arrived, he was the person who was called. And here is what "called" meant. A dying medieval Christian needed the sacraments. Specifically, they needed confession, the formal admission of sins to a priest, which required the priest to be physically present, physically close, leaning in to hear the whispered words of someone who was dying. They needed last rites, the anointing with holy oil, the final blessing, the prayers that were understood to determine whether the soul reached heaven or spent eternity elsewhere. This was not optional. This was not a formality. To the medieval Christian mind, dying without the sacraments was a catastrophe worse than death itself. It meant the possibility of damnation. So the priest came. He came to the bedside of every sick parishioner, leaned close, heard the confession, touched the dying person's forehead with oil, and prayed. And then he went to the next house, and the next. Parish priests across England died at a rate of roughly 42 to 45%, higher than the general population. The reason is not complicated. The job required sustained, repeated, close physical contact with the dying. They knew the risk. Not in the way we would understand it. They had no concept of bacterial transmission. But they could see that the people who spent time with the sick became sick. And they came anyway. Not all of them. Some fled. But enough of them stayed that the death rate among clergy exceeded the death rate among the people they served. The Bishop of Bath and Wells, Ralph of Shrewsbury, issued an extraordinary directive in 1349. He acknowledged that so many priests had died that parishes across his diocese had no one left to administer the sacraments. His solution, if no priest was available, the dying could confess their sins to any layperson present. Even to a woman, the bishop specified, a phrase that tells you everything about how desperate the situation had become in a church that did not permit women any sacramental role. The fact that this directive was necessary, that there were entire parishes in England where not a single priest remained alive, is the measure of what happened in the village. Picture a village of 200 people in the spring of 1349. The plague has been in England for 9 months. London is already devastated. Rumors have reached the village, travelers' stories, a merchant's warning at the last market, perhaps word from the priest who has heard from the bishop. The village knows something is coming. But something is abstract. The village has no frame of reference for a pandemic. The word does not exist. The concept does not exist. Disease, in the medieval understanding, is a punishment from God, or a result of bad air, miasma, or a consequence of planetary alignment. The village cannot prepare because the village does not know what it is preparing for. And then someone gets sick. It might be the miller who traveled to the market town last week. It might be a laborer who worked on a neighboring estate. The symptoms appear within days of exposure: fever, sweating, vomiting, and then the swellings. The buboes. In the groin, under the arms, on the neck. Black bruising beneath the skin. The name Black Death was not used at the time. They called it the pestilence, the great mortality, simply the death. But the progression was visible and terrifying, and fast. Most victims died within 3 to 5 days. The village has no quarantine protocol, no understanding of contagion, no way to isolate the sick person without also isolating the family, who share a single room, who sleep on the same straw, who breathe the same air. The priest is called. He comes. He does his duty. He goes home. Within a week, he is sick. The death of the village priest was not just a spiritual crisis. It was an administrative collapse. The priest kept the parish register, the record of births, marriages, and deaths that was the only written documentation of the village's existence. He mediated disputes. He read announcements from the... He was the single point of contact between the village and the institutional church, which was the single point of contact between the village and any authority larger than itself. When the priest died, the village lost its voice. The deaths continued, but the recording of deaths became inconsistent, fragmentary, or stopped entirely. This is why the mortality data from rural England during the Black Death is so uneven. In many villages, there was simply no one left who could write. The economic collapse of a plague village was as devastating as the human toll and happened simultaneously. A medieval village was not a collection of individual households operating independently. It was a system. The fields were plowed collectively or by arrangement with the Lord's manor. The harvest required coordination, specific people doing specific tasks at specific times. The animals needed daily tending. The mill needed a miller. The blacksmith needed to maintain the plow. Remove a third of the village population and the system does not shrink proportionally. It breaks. Fields went unplowed because the men who plowed them were dead. Harvests rotted in the fields because there was no one to bring them in. Animals wandered untended, starved, or were taken by neighboring villagers who were themselves barely surviving. The grain stores from the previous autumn, the food supply that was supposed to last until the next harvest, ran low, and there was no market functioning normally to replenish them. The monk Henry of Knighton wrote what has become one of the most cited observations of the rural plague. Many villages and hamlets have now become quite desolate. No one is left in the houses, for the people are dead that once inhabited them. He was not being literary. He was being precise. The archaeological record confirms what the chronicles describe. Settlements that contracted, shrank to a handful of households, and in some cases disappeared entirely. The Deserted Medieval Village Research Group has mapped thousands of these sites across England, places where people lived for generations, where houses stood and fields were tilled, and where after 1349 nothing remained but earthworks and pottery shards. Not all of these villages were killed directly by the plague. Many died slowly, over decades, as the economic aftermath made small settlements unviable. With fewer workers, the surviving laborers could demand higher wages, and they did, moving to estates that offered better terms, leaving the weakest villages to fade. Lords converted depopulated arable land to sheep pasture, which required fewer hands. The village that lost half its people to the plague in 1349 might lose the other half to economic migration over the following 50 years. The plague pulled the first thread. The economy unraveled the rest. Here's the thing about the plague in the village that distinguishes it from the plague in the city, and that changes everything about how you understand medieval England. In the city, the plague was experienced as a mass event. Thousands died. Mass graves were dug. The scale was visible, public, impossible to ignore. In the village, the plague was experienced as a sequence of individual losses. 200 people. You know every one of them. The blacksmith, the alewife, the reeve, the family in the cottage at the end of the lane. You watched them get sick one by one. You heard the coughing through the walls at night, and now you know what that coughing means, because you watched it happen to 3 families already. The isolation that was supposed to protect you has become a trap. There is nowhere to go. The nearest town is a day's walk, and the nearest town has the same problem. There is no authority to appeal to. The priest is dead. The Lord may have fled to another estate. The bishop is dealing with the same catastrophe across 100 parishes. You are alone with the dying in a way that no city dweller experienced, because a city dweller was at least surrounded by the living. In the village, by the 3rd week, the living were outnumbered. And the fear. Not the fear of death, Medieval people lived with death in a way that the modern mind has largely forgotten. The fear of dying without the sacraments, the fear of damnation, the fear that God had turned away. The flagellant movements that swept through continental Europe, groups of penitents who beat themselves in public, marching from town to town, did not gain the same traction in England, but the impulse behind them was universal. The belief that the plague was a punishment, and that some sufficient act of devotion or penance might stop it. Nothing stopped it. The village that had placed its entire spiritual life in the hands of one priest found itself without priest, without sacraments, without the liturgical structure that had organized every major event from birth to death. The Bishop of Bath and Wells told people to confess to each other, to a layperson, to a woman if necessary. The church was improvising, and the people in the villages, who had never known the church to improvise, who had understood the church as eternal and unchangeable, were watching it break down in real time. The plague in the village lasted, on average, 4 to 6 months from the first case to the last. In some settlements it was faster. In a few, it lingered. By the time it passed, by the time the dying stopped and the survivors could begin to assess what remained, the village was a different place. Not metaphorically, structurally. Houses stood empty. The fields were untended. The parish register, if it survived, showed a gap, entries that stopped abruptly and resumed in a different hand, or did not resume at all. The survivors were often the young, who had fewer social ties to the dead, and the fortunate, who, through some accident of genetics or exposure, had resisted the disease. They inherited a world that no longer functioned as they had known it. What happened next is what makes the Black Death not just a catastrophe, but a hinge. The survivors, the peasants who remained, discovered something that no one had told them and that the feudal system had been specifically designed to prevent. They had leverage. With half the workforce dead, labor was scarce. And scarce labor is valuable labor. Peasants who had been tied to the land, legally bound to their lord's estate, unable to leave without permission, unable to negotiate their wages, began to move. They walked to neighboring estates that offered better terms. They demanded higher pay. They refused conditions that their parents had accepted as immutable. The government responded with the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and prohibit peasants from leaving their villages. It did not work. The attempt to enforce it, the resentment it generated, contributed directly to the peasants' revolt of 1381. The plague did not create equality, but it cracked the foundation of a system that had kept inequality in place for 300 years. The church changed too. The rapid replacement of dead clergy with younger, less educated priests, the ordination age was lowered from 25 to 20, produced a generation of parish priests who were, by the standards of their predecessors, undertrained and underformed. The quality of the clergy declined. The authority of the church declined with it. The seeds of what would eventually become the Lollard movement, the proto-Protestant challenge to church authority in England, were planted in the soil of plague-emptied parishes where the institutional church had failed to protect, failed to explain, and failed to be present. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing a generation later, could portray corrupt and venal clergy in the Canterbury Tales because his audience had already lost the reflexive reverence that had shielded the church from criticism before 1348. The plague did not cause the Reformation, but it made the Reformation imaginable. That was medieval England. Over 10 videos, we have walked through the streets of 1348 London, where the sewage ran openly and the plague was on a ship from the south. We sat in the alehouse, drinking unfiltered ale from a bench-tested barrel. We rode with the cowboys of the 1870s frontier, $1 a day and no horse of your own. We stood in the ruins of 9th century England, living inside a civilization nobody could rebuild. We entered the medieval home, where every element was a source of danger. We visited the doctor, whose best treatment was 400 years from being correct. We were locked in the prison, where confinement meant something the modern mind cannot easily imagine. We walked the market, where the bread inspector checked whether bread was bread. We survived the night, 12 to 16 hours of complete darkness, vermin, cold, and a sleep pattern the modern world forgot. And now, finally, we have stood in the village when the plague came, and nobody came to help. Through all of it, people. People who woke up, dealt with what was in front of them, and kept going. Not because they were brave, because there was no alternative. Nobody told them it would end. Nobody could have. And that changes everything about how you think about the world you woke up in this morning.